Yeah, it is our great pleasure to have Laurie Norton Moffatt here with us tonight. She is the director and CEO of the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockport, Massachusetts, where we had the privilege of visiting as we were preparing for the show, and it is a wonderful institution. She's a leading scholar of American illustration art and has authored the Norman Rockwell Catalogue Raisonné and has led the growth of her museum from a small house in the artist's hometown to a global leader in illustration art exhibitions, scholarship, and digital collections connectivity. She founded the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies, the nation's first art history scholarly institute in American illustration art, which led to which is a hub of illustration art collections, museums, libraries, scholars, curators, and professors across the country. In recognition for the Norman Rockwell Museum's national service, President George W. Bush bestowed the National Humanities Medal to the museum, and President Barack Obama invited Laurie to the White House with Norman Rockwell's painting and the centerpiece of our exhibition, The Problem We All Live With, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement. She was a cultural specialist to Ethiopia and to Russia with the U.S. State Department. She currently serves on the boards of the Association of Art Museum Directors, of the Berkshire Bank, Berkshire Health Systems, and Connecticut College. She holds a bachelor's degree in art history and a MBA from the University of Massachusetts. She has become an esteemed collaborator with the BYU Museum of Art. We welcome you, Laurie Moffatt.
Thank you so much, Mark.
I'm so glad to have you.
Thank you. Let me do a sound check. Can you all hear?
Yes.
And you can see? Excellent. Wonderful. Before I begin, I would very much like to congratulate the BYU Museum of Art, my colleagues Jana and Mark and Marianne. This exhibition is so beautifully installed. Your whole museum is beautiful. I've had a chance now twice to go through the galleries when I was here for the opening and tonight. And it's really wonderful to be here at a university museum and know that so many students, so many young people, and look at all the families in the galleries. Just fantastic to be able to share our museum's collection with so many new generations. So what I want to do tonight is take you through a sort of a whirlwind of Norman Rockwell's life and his art. And I want to weave these two together so that you get a feel for his evolution as an artist, his development as a person, and also the arc of his art career, which culminated 65 years of painting so much of the 20th century, from really about 1912 until 1976. And his birth dates, his own life, he was born in the 19th century in 1894. And he died in 1978. So I want you to think about how much change he saw and chronicled, documented in 20th century America. We'll start here, just some pictures of his youth. I mean, you really get a sense of another era, not just another generation, but long skirts. Here, his upbringing in New York City and its environs. When New York still had cow pastures in the very northern parts of Manhattan, it's just not like that anymore. It's really kind of hard to imagine that things were, very urban but still a bit rural in that era. And this is his Norman there. Let's see, I do have a pointer, I think. Is this my pointer right here? Okay. This is Norman as a young boy and his brother Jarvis. And the two of them, very brotherly, very much loved each other, but one was a foil for the other because Jarvis was very athletic and very boyish and very outgoing. And Norman describes himself as having been awkward and clumsy, and his only talent was that he could draw. So you'll see this motif throughout the talk. This is the family going to Coney Island, going to the beach in New York. So you get a sense of really a very different era that Norman Rockwell was growing up into, that last bit of the 1800s, and the modernity of the 1900s was fast coming in. one of the hallmarks of Rockwell's work, I think, is this sense of contrasts that we see in his work. We're going to talk about this a little bit as we look at some of the images. And you get this sense now here, he's born in New York City, at 103rd in Amsterdam. He grows up in New York City and in metropolitan New York in the suburbs and environments. But in summers, he had the opportunity to go to the country. He spent summers in upstate New York, right near Vermont, and he loved it. He loved being out in the fields. He loved time with his cousins and friends. And so you get this wonderful reflection in his work of both the small town as well as the large urban city. Here he is with his family, his brother Jarvis again. Here's Norman Rockwell here and Jarvis and his parents. Oops, jumped over one. So you can see these in the exhibition. They're some of the very earliest works that we have in our collection. And these were done in the 1912, 1914 era. And Norman Rockwell would have just graduated out of art school. And we have so many young people in the museum tonight. I have to reveal that he dropped out of high school in 10th grade. Now, we don't recommend doing this, but he did make a very successful life for himself as an artist. But what he did do was go on to art school and professionally study art in New York City. So he didn't stop his education. He just went and specialized in art. And he had some wonderful teachers at a time in the early part of the 20th century where art was still taught in very classical ways. Any art students here tonight? Trained? I don't know what kind of training you had, but he was trained in figure drawing. He was trained in very traditional styles of painting and drawing. And this was really the last era in America that art was taught in the same way for all artists. It was right before art was to change and sweep through the 20th century with all the modern art movements. And so right out of art school, he was given an opportunity to take a job at the age of 18, and he became the editor of Boy's Life magazine. And this set him off on his very successful career as an artist who painted for magazine publications and was an illustrator, which is what he wanted to be, what he chose to be in art school. Admired all of the great illustrators before him from the golden age of illustration in the late 1800s, Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth. And he did some of his first commissions here for Boy's Life magazine. Here, Daniel Boone, mythical Daniel Boone coming and exploring the West. And oops, I'm pressing the wrong button. And here, the Conestoga wagon, and this sense of he's painting these boy adventure stories. And he's barely out of his boyhood himself. He's 18, he's read all these great stories, and he painted prolifically for both Boy's Life and many early magazines. Here, another black and white. And this is something I want you to take note of as we go through his work. Did it surprise you to see black and white images after seeing those big full-color canvases that we've come to expect from him? Well, this is a function of the printing technology of the day. So Rockwell had to first learn how to paint well to reproduce in black and white. I'm just going to go back for a second and look at this brown tone. They call this a sepia tone. And here we're in tones of gray, this engrisai. But either way, the tonality, the black and the white, had to register well in the magazine and bring the story to life for you. He was offered this first job because the scouting movement had just come across the Atlantic Ocean from England, and the chief scout, Sir Lord Baden-Powell, came to start a scouting movement in America in the early teens, and created Boy's Life magazine and was looking for an art editor for the magazine. And he came to the art school where Norman Rockwell was studying, and he asked the teachers there if they could recommend someone for this job, and that is how Norman Rockwell received his first job and his first really big I say break, but his first opening into this world of publishing and being a published illustrator. Here he is a little bit later in his, just a few years later, already a professional and becoming quite well known and setting dapper trends. We jump here in the period within 10 years, this is 1924, to these full color pictures. This was also done for Scouting, and Scouting became a theme through his life. He painted the covers of Boys Life magazine and the annual Scout calendar for 50 years. And this was his very first one, The Boy with Puppies. We're so pleased to have this in our collection. It was donated to us, and just last year we received 2 new donations of Scout pieces, because almost all of Norman Rockwell's Scouting pieces hang in the Boy Scout Museum in Irving, Texas. So a great collection there. I think they have 46 of Rockwell's Scout pieces. We have 4, and there are 2 more out there. So if you keep your eyes out for it, Mark, you might be able to secure a Scouting piece. So if we think about American history or world history, here he is painting for Scouting in 1914. And again, I showed you the color piece from 1924, but sandwiched in between there was World War I. And he wanted to do his part and step in and serve during the war. But as I mentioned to you, he was not particularly athletic. He was not physically strong. He didn't even weigh enough to be able to be enlisted in the military. And he had to go back to the doctor 3 times. And finally, on the day of his final physical, he drank 2 gallons of water and ate 3 pounds of bananas and stood on the scale with things in his pockets, and they accepted him. What did he do in the Navy, where he went to Charleston, South Carolina? What do you think he did? He painted. He was the base artist. It doesn't look like he saw too much combat or war here. And when people learned of his painting skills, he was already known in the magazines, and he was put to work and allowed to continue to paint motivational covers for the magazines. So you'll see underneath his signature in some of the works he did when he was in the Navy, he'll have his little private initials on there. And here he is, looking very much the sailor here in this picture. But he also became very popular with the officers on the base for painting their portraits. And he also illuminated the newspaper, Afloat and Ashore, which was the base newspaper. And he did a lot of drawings and fun things in that. But he was also here working on, these were propaganda posters for the US government. And this was advertising the career roles that you could have and the skills you would learn in the armed services. And here the GI telegrapher is very reminiscent of Rockwell trying out the style of many different artists. If any of you are familiar with J.C. Leyendecker's work, you'll notice that the style in this piece is a little more like Leyendecker, a little bit less like Rockwell, and you can tell that by all the very thin painted lines. It's not very thickly painted. It's much rougher, the chiseled face and figure. If you look at Leyendecker's work, you'll see Rockwell trying and experimenting with different styles at this time in his career. By the early 1920s, he was already famous. He was already profiled in the magazines. He was becoming a celebrity. He had a great fan following. And you'll see these wonderful portraits, studio portraits taken of him at the time. And he started out working on these series of works for a magazine called Country Gentleman. I don't know, can you guess what's going on in this picture? Spelling bee. Can you guess the word? Well, there's no way you can guess the word, but the word he was asked to, that he won, was spelling Peloponnesus. I'm not sure I can get the number of L's and P's correct in that word. But this is emblematic of the fictional characters that Rockwell created and had to create all his life. We look at his pictures now, and we look at the scene, and we think, well, of course, those are the people in it. But he had to invent those people. He had to think about these characters. He had to come up with this idea of the city cousin, the country cousin, the sort of goody two-shoes boy that he always had Cousin Reginald play. And later, when he shows the antics in the summer of his country cousins, always playing tricks on him. And we'll look at a couple of other pictures. But this was the sort of stage director in him that was already casting characters, coming up with costumes, coming up with stories to tell in these pictures. We very quickly move on into some exquisitely painted, beautiful works, for some of the other early magazines. Here, Ladies' Literary Digest, and look at the color now. This is just 10 years later, after the black and white, and the previous one we looked at, the black, red, and white, where red was the first color that was introduced into the printing process when it became affordable and easier to do for these kinds of throwaway pictures that would be in a magazine one week and then they would discard the magazine the next week. But now you're seeing this full color, beautiful, very old masters kind of composition, rich with detail. And you have to just look at everything. The doll here, one shoe on, one shoe off, and here, to the cobbler, maybe her grandfather, can he fix the little doll's shoe? The scraps of leather, the lantern, which is carboned up. You really have the sense of Dutch genre painting, Northern European Dutch genre painting in this. So one of Rockwell's hallmarks is that he always used real people as his models. For the nearly 4,000 pictures that he painted, he found a real person or several people to pose for each and every one. Think about how many people that is that he had to know during his lifetime, those 60, 70 years of painting. Models coming into his studio, and inevitably he had certain models that he was really fond of and that were his favorites because they were great actors. They could create these very expressive faces or hold poses, or were just really fun. He loved children, he loved people. This was a young boy named Billy Payne who was one of his favorite early models, and he poses here in the very first post cover that he painted, The Boy with Baby Carriage, in 1916. This was the picture that really set Rockwell's career on the road, because the Saturday Evening Post was considered the show window of the world. It was the most prevalent magazine of the day. It was the most widely read and published. It's estimated during its heyday that 1 out of every 4 Americans read this magazine. The subscriber, everyone in the household. It would then get passed around the neighborhood. It would sit in doctors' offices, and it was really an influential opinion maker in this country in both politics, editorial, literature, consumer goods, advertising. And if you were hired to be on the cover of the Post, you had hit the jackpot in the illustration world. And Rockwell painted for the Post for 47 years, a really long, prolific career. So I think you've seen this one. Hello. The signature image of the exhibition here. And now you see this dynamism, this movement coming into these pictures. Just a couple years after this previous one, which has some movement, but it's still pretty still. Now we've got all these angular lines and this sense of composition that is in motion, the dog here. And again, always these contrasts, the foil within a story, and the touches of red, the use of color that would pull your eye around through the picture on the cover. So he continued to paint for the Post. I can't show you all the covers, but the wonderful thing is you can see them all here with the exhibition in the beautiful open foyer gallery at the beginning of the exhibition. You can see all 321 covers that Norman Rockwell created. This, I think, is another especially wonderful piece of focusing on the doctor and doll. And now you have this really dominant use of the color red and very rich, saturated canvas, lots of detail coming into these pictures, and little still lifes on the background. But it's the expressions that really capture our hearts and our imagination. And I think you can tell now the painting is becoming a lot more sophisticated. The perspective, the composition, the character development, the expression and emotion in the pictures is really coming out. Now this picture is Gary Cooper posing as the Texan. And of course the foil here is the very virile cowboy is having makeup put on so that he can go on film and look as natural and rugged as he is supposed to look. But Rockwell was actually going to Hollywood a bit already in the 1930s, where he met his second wife, Mary, after the divorce of his first wife, to whom he'd been married for 14 years. And we see him here on a stage set being asked for his autograph. He's here with a movie star, but she wants his autograph because he's just as famous already as the stars. So we have this sense of storytelling, these images that, sorry, the slide looks a little bit out of focus here. This sense of longing. This clerk is bored in his bookkeeping job, and he's dreaming of adventure. And then a week later in the magazine appears the pirate who's had this amazingly adventuresome life. He's lost a leg and he's just really had it. His clothes are ripped and all he can think about is home sweet home. So you had this sense of storytelling. We didn't have the sitcoms on TV yet, but people could look forward to sort of a series sometimes with Rockwell's work where they would wonder what's coming next. And particularly some of the other magazines, the Country Gentleman works, where he had 20 of these pictures of Cousin Reginald and his friends, became something fun to look forward to. And this sold more magazines. There was a marketing ploy behind this, and fortunately Rockwell loved to paint, but the editors of the magazines knew when they put a Rockwell on the cover that they would sell more pictures. But here now, 1927, I want you to just look at this incredible maturity of Norman Rockwell as an artist. About 13 years after that first Daniel Boone black and white picture that we looked at. And here, absolutely masterful, full color, old master style painting with this incredibly luminous light. It's more beautiful in the picture, in the painting, than it is even here on the slide. It's just almost as beautiful as the golden sunset here in the mountains that I can't take my eyes off of when I'm out here. And really fun details. The checkers just pop off the board there. And I had an amazing experience once giving a tour to some visitors in our museum, and they were hearing impaired and deaf, and they had a translator, they had a signer translating my tour. And suddenly the room got very animated, and finally the translator translated to me, and because everybody was talking and signing, and she said, well, you know what everybody's observing is the hand motion for I beat you, I won, was this. And we don't know, we don't have any reason to think Norman Rockwell knew sign language back when this was painted, but maybe it's just a universal language. But it was really fun that the picture spoke to everybody without words and with this natural gesture. And there is a story that goes with this. This clown was very depressed and he just wasn't able to get out in the ring and make people laugh. So the ringmaster and everybody played with checkers with him, and they allowed him to win, was the story, but he thought he had won the game to boost his spirits. And this is a wonderful companion piece, Outward Bound, again about that same era, the mid to late 1920s. And very different palette, the blues now. These were the last colors to come into the printing process, the blues and greens, and maybe adding the yellow in. So we've finally had the full 3-color plus black offset lithography for magazine printing. This is believed to be off of the North Shore of Massachusetts around Gloucester, Rockport area. And quite unusual because we don't see the faces of the figures. This is not common for Norman Rockwell to have asked us to get the sense of longing and remembrance of the grandfather and telling the stories to his grandson here of his times out at sea. Now I mentioned to you that part of what any illustrator did was do advertising art, and this was for the sales of products, consumer products. And he had some wonderful commissions in his early young years. But even the illustrators had a dividing line. Art was dividing between fine art and illustration, and within illustration, being a cover artist was highly esteemed. Being a commercial artist and doing advertising was just the bottom of the barrel. And there's a fun chapter in Norman Rockwell's autobiography that he signed his name in blood with one of his studio mates, that they wouldn't ever stoop so low as to do commercial advertising. But then, of course, they had to put food on the table, and they had some great commissions. And here, for Sun-Maid Raisin Growers, he did these wonderful Vermeer-like images. There's another one here. It's just so lovely. But look at this. Can you see this little shadow here? They actually pasted a raisin box on the painting so that when it was photographed, you'd get the full dimensionality and the actual real product. So at some point, the decision was made to take the box off the painting, but the shadow of the glue still remains, telling us this was a work of commercial art, even though it's just so beautifully painted. This was his mother, his mother-in-law, his wife's mother, in this picture. So I mentioned to you that he had an early marriage. They had no children with his wife Irene O'Connor, and they divorced in the late 1920s. And on one of his trips to California, Norman Rockwell met Mary Barstow, and you see them here with their wedding picture. And they moved back east and still lived in New Rochelle, New York for a short time, which is where he lived after growing up in Manhattan and going to school in Mamaroneck and dropping out of school in Mamaroneck and going back to the city to art school, and then established a studio in New Rochelle, New York, in the same studio that Frederick Remington had painted in. So you see this cluster of artists in these art colonies. New Rochelle had a lot of the illustrators, but also some of the very important American painters and painters of the American West. And eventually Norman Rockwell designed and built his own studios. But here, some really nice, wonderful, homey pictures of him with his wife. And always pets. They always had dogs all his life. And so we see his sons. There's Jarvis on the left here, and Jarvis is in the middle, and this is Tom, his middle son, and his youngest son, Peter. They were all artistic. They're all still living. They're 80 to 84 now, and maybe 79 to 84. And Jarvis is a very contemporary artist. He likes to acquire all the little tiny toys, all the ephemeral toys that come out after the movies, the Star Wars and Transformer robots, the little Japanese Transformer toys, McDonald's Happy Meals. It doesn't matter. These little throwaway toys, and then he arranges them all in these spectacular formations, and you have this collision of cultures of all these different movie characters, and very creative mind. Tom was a children's author. He created young adult fiction. You might have heard of or seen the movie How to Eat Fried Worms. That was Tom's story. How to Fight a Girl, and How to Become Filthy Rich. Those were three of his titles, kind of fun. And Peter's a very successful sculptor. He lives in Rome, Italy, and he has had a lot of sculpture commissions all over this country. He's carved gargoyles on the National Cathedral in Washington, and he's has many works around Rome in different settings. So after he married Mary, he was really seeking a quieter life, if it's possible for him to have secured such a thing, since he was already a celebrity. But he moved to Arlington, Vermont from New Rochelle, New York. New Rochelle was a very debonair, swanky place. It was the roaring 20s when he was living there. It was the fashion capital. The illustrators were designing all the fashions of the day. When he moved to Arlington, Vermont, he moved to a community of about 1,400 people. where there weren't even private telephone lines yet. And it was really cold and isolated in the winter, and it was just a completely different life for them. And this is where they raised their family and really had a wonderful community of friends around them. They were beloved in their community, and he made many, many wonderful friends. And Arlington had, similar to New Rochelle, was something of an artist colony for illustrators. Meade Schaefer was living there, Dean Cornwell, John Atherton, some of the notable names that were also publishing in the Saturday Evening Post at the time. So Norman Rockwell was able to surround himself by his artistic influences and people with whom he could, trade advice and give opinion on pictures and be in that artistic milieu. He could also go to community suppers. They had square dances, and here we see Mary Rockwell with Grandma Moses, who had her studio right across the New York State border in Hoosick, New York. So again, these artistic friends that they could surround themselves with. And we get a sense of this wonderful time of family life here in this now mid-career post cover of the Christmas Homecoming. And we see many of his family members here, including Norman Rockwell himself right here, and Mary. And this is his oldest son, Jarvis, now coming home, laden with Christmas presents and dirty laundry. And his middle son, Tom, and then Peter is over here. And he used this young girl to pose twice to create twins. They weren't really twins, but he wanted to bookend the painting, and it was great for the composition. And this young fellow just looking up to his hero. And these are all his friends and neighbors. Truly, these were the people he was surrounded by in Arlington, Vermont. Initially, a very, very happy chapter in his life that was to sadden. And here you have a sense of what that community life was like. He'd be working on a picture, and he'd invite people in. He'd say, "What do you think? Tell me, what does it need? Is it finished? Can you read the story? Can you tell what's going on?" And so there were always people whose opinions he was seeking, and I'm sure he did the same for the other artists in the Vermont community where he was living. These are some of the portrait commissions he would sometimes have. A portrait of Colonel Ayres in Virginia. I don't know how he secured these commissions at times, but he did have sort of running throughout his life this very small line of portraiture that he would occasionally do for people. But most of his portraits were for the Saturday Evening Post. And of course, here we have the iconic gossips. And this picture has become so ubiquitous that there have been many, many derivative versions used on the cover of the phone book many years ago. We hardly have phone books anymore, do we? But this was a kind of fun story because it's the idea of the gossip chain in the small little community of Vermont. And in order to make this a kind picture, because Norman Rockwell was always kind in his pictures, even when he was a prankster and a jokester, he put himself in the picture. And he thought, no problem, if the joke's about me, then nobody will be upset with me. And if I have my wife passing the gossip along right with everybody else in town, then surely everybody will be happy about this picture. But the story goes that the lady who apparently started the gossip and it spread all through town was really not very happy to see herself on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post nationwide as the town gossip, and she never spoke to him again. I don't know if that's really true, but that's the story we hear. I don't think she liked being the gossip. And here, just to give you a little glimpse of how he would go about painting these pictures, in his early years, models would pose, and for a child to have to sit still for an hour while he posed, he would take $1 in nickels, and for every 5 minutes, he'd transfer a coin so that the child's pile would get bigger and his would get smaller, and people could hang on a little bit longer. Reminds me a little bit of the exhibition of having to smile for an hour in those videos, very hard. And, but in later years, he used photography, and he had a photographer who would, Norman Rockwell would coach and pose the models, but the photographer would take many pictures, and then he could choose the expressions and the poses he wanted to begin to build the collage of his pictures. So here we see him posing himself, looking a bit angry about, "You've called me, this gossip chain in town." So it was while he lived in Arlington, Vermont, that he painted the Four Freedoms. And we're moving right along through the decades now, here into the 1940s and World War II. And the Four Freedoms were concepts that were articulated by President Roosevelt, although they often came to be known as Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms. But these were ideals of a world in which everybody would be entitled to these four basic freedoms: the freedom to speak their mind, the freedom to worship according to their own religion and own conscience, the right, freedom from want, the right to have adequate food and clothing and shelter, and the last freedom from fear, to be able to live without fear of your government or of terror or war. And we have a little clue here in the headline on this picture, the bombing horrors mentioned in London. But when President Roosevelt first spoke these ideals to really mobilize this nation to say why it was necessary for America to enter World War II, to defend these freedoms and free Europe from the Nazi takeover that had happened, there was still a certain amount of resistance, a certain amount of isolationism in our nation, and people weren't understanding what President Roosevelt was really calling for with these freedoms. And so the government asked writers to write about them, and eventually asked visual artists to try to portray them in visual images. And so Norman Rockwell was not the only artist who was creating versions of the Four Freedoms, but surely his became the most memorable. Contemporary painters like Ben Shahn did series of the Four Freedoms. A German emigre, Arthur Schick, did versions of the Four Freedoms in very sort of medieval manuscript style. But it was Norman Rockwell's portrayals of showing our everyday life, our family life that we all enjoy, that became used as war bond posters. And you see these posters in the exhibition here, and traveled the country and helped to raise more than $133 million at the time, which was an extraordinary amount of money raised for the war effort through war bonds. He was also painting some other posters and motivational images. Here, the coal miner, you'll see the star of two children in presumably sons, but maybe a daughter, serving in the war, and he was doing his part to mine the coal and have enough energy to, as you see here, give them enough and on time. This is the only picture we know of where Rockwell really looked more at, what war was like. Here you see the soldier and the machine gunner. Mostly his images painting during the war still focused on life at home or off-duty time for the GI, a series of a fictional soldier named Willie Gillis, a private. And just a glimpse of Norman Rockwell actually painting and working on this picture in his studio. So again, he turned his labor and his time and his imagination to serve the war during World War II, creating some of the most memorable images of that period. And one last one at the end of the war was actually never published, but the fellows here in the diner are listening to the radio announcing the end of the war, and that Europe had been liberated, the Nazis had surrendered, and the war was over. Beautiful portraits, a series of presidential portraits he was to paint over time for the Saturday Evening Post. Here, President Eisenhower, and one more sort of end of the war period, Thanksgiving 1944, with a mother's gratitude for her son coming home safely And he's happy to be on KP duty and home again. And this incredible abundance of apples and potatoes and cranberries, all the cornucopia of food on the table. So there was another kind of illustration art that Rockwell painted from time to time, and these were his story illustrations painted for the centerpieces of magazines, and these actually illustrated another story, another author's words or story. And they differ from a magazine cover in that you really can't tell what the whole story is. This is one vignette from the story, but we don't know, we can't tell everything from this image, whereas a cover has to tell you the entire story in one frame. This is designed to lure you in and want to read the story and intrigue you enough to get you to pick up the magazine and read it all the way through. Or maybe sometimes these stories were published in serial form week after week, so you'd want to buy the next one so that you could get the next picture and story. But how reminiscent of Bellows here. These pictures are very long, about 6 feet long. I think you have a couple of them in the exhibition here. The Aunt Ella Takes a Trip. And these would have typically been published in the middle of the magazine over a 2-page spread. So they would jump the gutter of the magazine, which is why there's often this sort of big area in the middle without much action happening, because you know how it is, you open that magazine and there's an inch of the picture you can't see. So you have to have this gutter that the picture proportions come back together more closely. So I'd like to take you through a series of his later post-cover works, but also one where I can show you a little bit about the process of how he worked on a picture, and also an image where we see the fairly unusual circumstance of featuring African Americans and minorities on the cover of a magazine, which was simply forbidden by editorial policy, and the only way it was permissible was if the individuals were in service roles, which is what you see here with the Pullman porter. And he uses his son, Peter, as the young boy, trying to figure out the tip. And I love the comic book in his pocket here, and his striped socks, and the very kindly expression on the porter as he sees the young boy traveling on his own. But look at how Rockwell experimented and posed some other young boys. This one is middle son, Tom, and there's Jarvis in the mirror. Now he's not quite as young. He's maybe a little more sophisticated, a little more worldly, so he went back to the younger boy, and here you see Norman Rockwell actually coaching him in this picture, which is kind of fun. And look at how he's put the table up on table legs to have this slanted table to maybe this was a tray that came down. I'm not quite sure why the table would have been slanted on the train, but he was trying to create some effects that would be consistent. And finally, he comes up with the composition of the young boy here that he chose. And he did the same with the porters. He tried an older man, he tried a younger man, but he ends up choosing the older porter and the younger boy because it creates greater contrast and really a great sense of sympathy and empathy in this picture. But all that work and choosing of different models and exploration to come up with the final composition. So we're just going to run through a few of the really favorite fun post covers. I think the pictures tell the stories. There aren't too many things for me to add, but I do want to make sure you take note of Grandma here in the back seat. Paced herself through the day. Her expression hasn't changed a bit. She is coming home with a plant in her lap, so she had some fun as well. I think this is truly one of Rockwell's most extraordinary paintings, the Breaking Home Ties. Again, we see this contrast of the father, the rancher, and his son is eagerly waiting for the train so he can head off to college, and the father so sad and realizing his son may or may not come home again, but he will certainly come home older, more grown young man. And we get a sense of his mother is present in the lunch she wrapped up with a little pink string, and the dog here. This was at the time that Norman Rockwell's sons would have been growing up and going away to college. And it's also the period in his life where his wife was becoming ill. And it was a very sad time in Norman Rockwell's life. And he was painting some pretty extraordinary paintings, sometimes very happy paintings, of this era in the 1950s. And a number of pictures about artists, art about art. And I want to run you quickly through a series to show you how Rockwell made a picture, because he would start these big 3-4 foot canvases with a tiny little sketch that would fit in the palm of your hand, just a little thumbnail sketch here, and work out the idea, and then map it out larger in a larger sketch. And notice the experimentation of the different pictures that are going on in the background. And we work through a lot of expressions. This is his wife, Mary, posing for these grandes dames. And here a very enchanting picture of Mary. Flirty and all different kinds of poses, and then he puts them back together. He's chosen the final image, and now we have a completely different painting in the background with the Cavaliers aghast and leering down at the young man as he inspects the brooch on the amused woman. So I love this picture. It's stories within a story, but he takes us through the entire day of this young girl. There was a companion piece, The Day on the Life of a Little Boy, and he runs them through the day. And just take a look at how the lighting changes, that bright afternoon sunlight, the movie theater light indoors, the birthday party in the evening, and coming home by moonlight, and going to bed and writing about it in her diary. Each one a separate little frame and story that he tells us. And he uses his favorite model, Mary Whalen here, who's gotten herself into a bit of a jam and looks quite proud of it, doesn't she? And it looks like the principal's called her mother in and saying, we don't know what we're going to do about Mary. And this picture hangs in the Wadsworth Athenaeum. I love this piece. And he apparently wanted to find a child or an adult, anybody with a real black eye, so that he would know, I'll get all the colors right. So we put an ad in the paper looking for anyone with a black eye to please come to his studio so he could photograph and paint the real thing. So continuing to work through this 1950s period, this sense of transitions, you can imagine he's watching his own children grow up, he's watching their friends grow up, he's watching his favorite models move out of their adolescence into their young adulthood, move from their childhood into their adolescence, and that's very much the subject of this picture, Girl at Mirror, the portrait of Jane Russell in her lap and throwing away her childhood toys, experimenting with her mother's makeup. And another loss of innocence picture here. And this tour de force of Shuffleton's barbershop, so much detail in this picture and so many layers we're looking through. We can see we're looking through the window. Here's the crack in the pane of glass that takes us into the room, the shadows that bring us back into the light, this receding sense of planes, and all of the detail in this barbershop. And end of day, the gentlemen coming together for a good time in the making music in the antechamber there. But the wood stove is just a wonderful sense of still lifes in this picture. And this painting, which was famous long before it sold for $46 million 2 years ago, and set the all-time American art record of an American artist's work sold at auction. And this is within the traditional arts. The contemporary art sells in the hundreds of millions, but Now we go from Rockwell having really been on the outs in the art world for so very many years when all the modern art movements came in, to now holding his own firmly and really establishing the peak record in American art, and really being highly regarded and respected for the extraordinary painting that he was doing. And just a couple more wonderful post covers from this 1950s period. Red Sox locker room, Ted Williams in here, and then the rookie coming in. Doesn't look like he's being very warmly welcomed, does it? So this was painted at a fun period. Well, not a fun period, but it's actually a very sad period in his life. But it's fun in that he did this for his autobiography, which was published in the Saturday Evening Post 2 years after his wife died. And Mary died in 1959, and he worked on this piece in the early 1960s when he was dictating his autobiography to his son. So he was reflecting on his life and also his inspirations. What's kind of fun about this is he references Howard Pyle. The initials HP are here on the treasure chest, and Pyle was very famous for the pirates that he painted and the galleons, and he starts an American family here, which splits during the American Civil War, and the South goes west, and you have the rancher, and then you get the sort of Puritan side of the family here, and the flappers, and coming back together with the all-American boy at the top of the tree. The Golden Rule came out of a picture done earlier in the 1950s, a study for the United Nations. And then he went back to this study, which he never quite finished, and he turned it into this beautiful picture of the Golden Rule, which he had studied and determined was the single tenet that was present in almost every religion in the world. And he felt this was the common unifying belief of all of mankind. And he tried to portray that by showing all of the different religions and races and peoples in this painting. And another capstone post cover that is really fun, because I think he confronts, it's 1961 or 62 now in this picture, and Rockwell is completely out of step with where the art world had gone. Jackson Pollock's work had swept in 1949, 1950, and abstract expressionism had completely replaced representational art, and Rockwell was still creating his paintings, but here I think he shows this juxtaposition of kind of saying, where do I fit in this art world today? But how wonderful he shows us how I can paint like Jackson Pollock as well as Norman Rockwell. And here we get a sense of him in his studio trying his best. He's looking a little tepid about that. Jackson Pollock's expressive gestures. He actually cut some of these out and entered them into some contemporary art exhibitions in the Berkshires where he lived. But the museum director, Stuart Henry, was on to him, and he said, Norman, go back to painting what you're really good at. And this culminated with his triple self-portrait, the signature image on his autobiography. And he tells us a little bit about his artistic heroes. We have Dürer. I'm sorry I missed your Dürer exhibition here. And Rembrandt, Picasso, and Van Gogh. And he does a lot of portrait studies and tells us a little bit about his studio, although he was not a messy painter by habit, but he makes it a little bit disheveled here. And he references a studio fire that burnt his studio to the ground from a paint rag that caught fire in his waste bucket there from some pipe ashes. And we move now into the era of the 1960s and 70s. The last commissions he was going to work on, but what a dynamic, incredible chapter it was. He was commissioned to work for Look magazine. The Post was declining, readership was declining, advertisers were switching from magazine advertising to television. And just like today, everybody's advertising's fragmented. You have to get onto the internet, and you need television, and you need radio. And so the magazines were really struggling, just like newspapers are today. And Rockwell left the Post, which did close in a few years. He left the Post in '63, and in 1964 he started working for Look magazine. Pictures that are as relevant and contemporary today, sadly enough, in some cases, as they were when they were painted. All the elements of strife and juxtaposition in the Middle East present in this piece. And some of the signature civil rights images, which Jana noted are in this exhibition here, The Problem We All Live With painting, and you had Ruby Bridges speak here for the opening of the show. She serves on the board of the Norman Rockwell Museum, and she's shown here as a young girl walking to school to integrate her elementary school, the very first child in New Orleans to integrate her school. Rockwell actually used local models for this image and tried several different ages of young girls to get the one that best represented Ruby in this picture. This quick series about the Peace Corps shows the formation of the Peace Corps by President Kennedy. And oops, I jumped over something. This picture that was done for Look magazine. But some of the study sketches and the fact that Norman Rockwell actually traveled to some of the countries where Peace Corps workers were enlisted. And here he is in Ethiopia and painting portraits and doing some of the work for coming back and doing the magazine series. I just give you a little sense of the traveling he did with his third wife, Molly Rockwell, whom he was to meet and marry after his wife Mary died. And they traveled quite extensively together all over the world. And a culminating piece for Look magazine, The Right to Know, the sense that we have the right to know what our government is doing and thinking, and we sit here in the judge's seat being faced by a sea of people now that you will see now is fully reflective of the population of the United States in its full diversity, even taking a stab at some flower children here during the 1960s and early 70s. And it was also the era where man landed on the moon. So when you think about this era, this arc that Rockwell painted, from watching the Armada stream back into New York Harbor during the Spanish-American War, to all the sense of invention that he painted throughout his life, to man landing on the moon, it was truly a remarkable era that we're so fortunate, I think, to have his documentation. This is his town of Stockbridge, where the museum is located, where he lived the final 25 years of his life. And a picture of us in springtime. And we'll just take a little walk into his studio. Here it is relocated on the grounds of the Norman Rockwell Museum. And its interior shows you all his working supplies and props. And we've actually reinstalled it to reflect the period of 1960 when he was working on the Golden Rule. But you see, actually, this is one of his Peace Corps in Karachi, Pakistan here, drawing for it and working, doodling there on his sofa, posing as the Indian here for the movie Stagecoach, which he actually had a silent part in, and you have all the wonderful series of the Stagecoach actors and actresses here in the exhibition. And he had a silent role as Busted Flush in his ratty hat there. And just a little quick visit to Stockbridge so you can see the museum and the grounds. These are sculptures by his son Peter, and you see his studio situated there in the autumn. And a sculpture by Peter on the grounds here in the winter. And I'll invite you in to our Robert A.M. Stern building that we built about 20 years ago, and take you through a little glimpse of the galleries. And conclude with a portrait of this wonderful painter that we're so happy to be able to share this artwork with you here at BYU, and I thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you.